My name is Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thanks for joining us. Today's program features Jody Rosen, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, and is moderated by Global Santa Fe's program chair, Jim Falk. I want to extend a special thanks to Global Santa Fe for inviting our Dallas-Fort Worth Council to partner on this webinar. It's always so nice when we have a number of councils from around the nation collaborating so that we can work to bring you insightful conversations. Also partnered with us this evening are our sister and brother councils around the nation, including Alaska World Affairs Council, World Affairs Council of Connecticut, World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, World Affairs Council of Jacksonville, and World Oregon. I'd like to also thank our webinar partners outside the council network for joining us tonight: Greater Dallas Bicyclists, White Rock Roadies, and Santa Fe Century. It's great to have you all on. Whether you live in Santa Fe, Dallas-Fort Worth, or any other part of the US, please consider joining your local World Affairs Council. It means a lot to us. We have 90 councils in 42 states, and we're all working together to build a more informed citizenry and engaging each other in important discussions. So join us. I'd like to mention before we get started an upcoming 2-week trip that I'm going to lead to Japan next spring. And I started my career in Japan, living there for several years. And so I know we are in for a treat. We're going to be visiting, of course, Tokyo and Kyoto, but we also have a lot of other favorite destinations. I hope you'll consider joining us and check out our website at dfwworld.org. And now let's get started with this evening's program. I'd like to introduce my friend, Jim Falk, who will moderate this conversation. Jim is not only the Global Fe Programs Chair on their board of directors, but he is also President Emeritus of our council here in Dallas-Fort Worth. And he also started the original World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth cycling club. And now I know that there is a version 2 going strong in Santa Fe. And so many of you will not be surprised that he brought this program to us. And I know it's going to be an excellent conversation as he has such a passion for cycling. Jim, thank you again. Jody, thanks for joining us. We're excited about this conversation. And Jim, I'm going to let you take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Liz. Welcome, Jody. Before we get started, I have to say that Liz Brailsford has lots of qualifications, and we had many applicants for my position. But the key thing was that she was a cyclist. And when she first came to Dallas to check things out, we had arranged, Jody, for everybody to meet on a cold Sunday morning. And she did darn well. So that's how she earned her position as now the great president of the World Affairs Council. Jody, let me just add a few things about your bio so that people will have a picture of where you compose some of your lyrics and write some of the music reviews that you do. Probably the best ones come out when you're riding your bicycle around Manhattan and Brooklyn. Jody, as Liz mentioned, is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. He's also written for Slate and a number of other Rolling Stone and many other magazines where his musical critics reviews have been included. Let me just grab a few titles of recent New York Times Magazine articles. Willie Nelson's Long Encore. Why are bikes so much fun? Because they're not cars. And then those of you who live in Dallas, you may not appreciate this one quite as much. When George W. Bush confused Russia's war in Ukraine with Iraq. So with that introduction, Jody, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be here. Hi.
So we're going to try to maybe screen share a few things, but we had some problems a minute ago. But let's just start with what got you interested in this topic. And there's so many books on cycling that have been written, but you took a different tact.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess first and foremost, I'm a cyclist. I have been for, most of my life. I guess I think I learned to ride around age 5, if memory serves. And it's my means of daily transportation here in New York City. I don't own a car, so I certainly have a personal passion for bike riding. But also, as you mentioned, the literature on the bicycle is vast, but it's I'd say it's slanted in a particular direction. It's very sentimental, romantic literature, I'd say. I mean, a lot of the writing on the bike kind of, positions the bike as a noble and ennobling machine. Bike writers are very often bike riders and are quite passionate about the subject. And that's not to say in any way that this book is in its way a romantic book about cycling. On the contrary, it is. But I tried to take a slightly more skeptical approach to viewing the bicycle's long, 200-year long history and looking at its role in the present world. And also the way we write and talk about bicycles, generally speaking, particularly here in the U.S. and in the West, is with a very sort of American-centric and Eurocentric bias. But in fact, most of the bikes in the world are in the global South, are in the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I tried to write a sort of fuller. To write a history and a journalistic account of the bicycle that took in, a global picture, and maybe presented a slightly more skeptical take on the bicycle's history, letting some of the darker aspects of the bicycle and its place in the world in, as well as championing the bicycle.
Jody, let me jump in there and ask you to talk more about how your experience in training as a journalist really, in a sense, shaped the book as well.
Well, I guess I'd say that, I've worked as a journalist for quite some time now, couple decades, 2-3 decades, and have done a lot of reporting. So, when I came to this book, the topic of this book, I wanted to write a book that was historically informed, that had a lot of history in it, but wasn't a history per se, or wasn't a history full stop. So I wanted to write a book that kind of crossed genres a little bit, and that that included not just accounts of the bicycle's rise in the 19th century and its story through the 20th century, stuff about its technical development, how the bicycle works as a device, as a machine, but also get out in the world and report. So there's a good deal of reportage in this book. Some of the stories I tell in this book, trips to, for instance, places like Bangladesh and Bhutan were undertaken when I, in my capacity as a reporter from the New York Times. So I went there to do stories in certain cases about bicycles, or in certain cases I kind of double dipped, went to Bangladesh to do reporting about the terrible traffic chaos in the capital city, Dhaka. Yeah.
We're going to get to some of those stories. Yeah. Why did it take so long for the bicycle to be invented? Because it just seems, that it did take a long time. The bicycle, what's the date of when the bicycle was, quote, invented?
Yeah, so the first proto bicycle arrives in 1817. So in the second decade of the 19th century, it was invented by a minor German nobleman named Karl von Drais in the city of Mannheim in that year. And as for the question of why it arrived so relatively late, this is a mystery. The book I've written is called Two Wheels Good: The History and Mystery of the Bicycle. And one of the abiding mysteries of the bicycle's history is how come it took so long to get this thing? Because in fact, the technology necessary to create a bicycle has existed since the early Middle Ages, but it was really only at this moment in the in the kind of early part of the 19th century that we got this first proto-bicycle. We're looking at a picture of it now, I see on the screen. So the image that you see on, I guess, the left, with the adult, the illustration of that fellow with the mustache straddling that curious machine, that is Carl von Dreis's Laufmaschine, as it was called in German, or running machine. You can see it's a bicycle without pedals. So the first bicycle, the reason I call it a proto bicycle is it wasn't the bicycle that we know today, you know, with pedals and with all the various apparatus that have been a part of the bicycle's design since the late 19th century. This was the kind of first try, and it really was a machine that you straddled, as you can see, a little bit like a horse, and you propelled it by scooting your feet across the ground. And so the other picture you see on the screen there on the right is of a balance bicycle, this very similar device that many children use these days or to learn how to ride, because after all, the trick of riding a bicycle really is just learning to balance your body on the machine, to kind of straddle the machine and keep it upright. So in this sense, the history's first bicycle, this bicycle that arrived 200 years ago, anticipates what is today the starter bicycle for many children here in the United States and around the world. But to return to your first question, just briefly, like, as for why it took so long, it really is a puzzlement, and the bicycle was kind of an anachronism at its birth, because at this moment in 1817, the bicycle arrived a full decade and a half after the invention of the steam locomotive. So in a sense, humankind should have been already progressed on from a device like the bicycle, but it arrives after we already have steam locomotives and trains. When we finally get the so-called safety bicycle, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but when we get the kind of the bicycle achieves its kind of ideal form in the late part of the 19th century, in 1885, when it was first brought to market, that was the same year that Carl Benz was marketing his first Motorwagen. So the kind of automotive age is stirring right when we finally get a perfected bicycle. So the bicycle's history presents many curiosities and oddities, and one of them is just this question of how come this device, which someone could have cooked up in the year 670, only arrived 12 centuries after that. Well, I don't think we'll ever quite get a good answer.
One of the interesting things about von Drais that I read was that he invented the meat grinder and the keyboard for the typewriter. I mean, amazing guy,
yeah,
but died penniless.
Yeah, he was sort of a visionary. He was really a tinkerer. I mean, he was kind of a rich boy who had this post as a forester in the Duchy of Baden, which was really a cushy job. Which it gave him sort of effectively a stipend. It was a salary that he was paid to hold this post of forester, for which he did very little work in forestry, and it gave him time to sit around and tinker with various inventions. And he was, as you say, interested in all kinds of machines and problems, but he had a kind of long-term interest in the question of wheeled transport, in this question of like how human beings could move swiftly across land under their own power, that is to say, not in a vehicle drawn by a draft animal, by like a donkey or a horse or a dog. And so it was him that made this kind of crucial breakthrough, and realized that you could line up two wheels in a row. That is to say, not side by side connected by an axle, but one right in front of the other, and kind of connect them with some sort of bar or wooden stick or device, and use your own weight and balance and sense of balance, straddle the machine and create a new kind of vehicle. This was the big eureka moment, the idea that putting one wheel in front of the other would work as a transport device, because of course it seems illogical. It's the kind of thing which if you leave that thing standing without a kickstand or anything to support it, it will just topple over, which is different than most wheeled vehicles that were designed up to that point.
We're going to get to some of the global issues in a few minutes, but because I know we have a lot of cyclists, on the program. You had mentioned the word Benz, of Mercedes-Benz later, but the wheel, the tire, and Dunlop played a big role in that. Just take a minute briefly to explain how the tire came about, because that was really quite unique.
Right. There were various different attempts to. There were various different iterations of the bicycle through the 19th century. So, in the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, you had a kind of vogue, particularly in France, for something called the bone shaker, which was a wooden and iron bike with kind of iron shod wooden wheels. These didn't work very well. It certainly made for a very a juddering and unpleasant ride, thus the nickname Bone Shaker. Then, of course, a little later on, you have the famous penny farthing. That's that wild-looking bike of the 1870s with the giant front wheel and the very small rear wheel, which was extremely difficult to mount and hard to ride, but is a wondrous-looking device. And the tires for that device were rubber, but they were sort of hardened rubber. It was a little bit like what you might see on like a Spalding or like, a rubber ball. That is to say, it was not a pneumatic tire with like a rubber, like a rubber tubing filled with an air filled inner tube. And it was this Scottish born, Irish, Belfast based veterinarian, John Boyd Dunlop, who in the 1880s came up with the idea to create a pneumatic rubber tire that is to address the issue of both the discomfort of riding a bicycle and the sluggishness of the ride. He was the one who realized that if you put an inner tube filled with air into a bike, it would both be a smoother ride and a faster ride. That was really one of a few major kind of technological breakthroughs in this period of the 1880s that gave us the modern bicycle and sent millions, charging into the late 19th century on two wheels.
So let me remind our viewers, if you wish, please go ahead and ask a question, and we'll work them into the conversation this evening with Jody. So, we talk about the word road rage, especially in Texas. The bicycle really was a disruptor. Schumpeter would have been could have written a lot about the bicycle. Put a lot of people out of business, at least for a short period of time, didn't it?
Yeah, this was particularly in this period of the great bicycle boom of the 1890s. So to just give you a quick sketch of the history, we have the invention of the so-called safety bicycle. That is the modern looking bicycle that we recognize today, just like the one that's on the pillow over your right shoulder there, Jim. A bike with two equal-sized wheels and a kind of diamond-shaped frame, and the rear-driven chain drive and those pneumatic rubber tires. That's the modern bicycle that arrives in the 1870s and is kind of perfected and brought to market in around 1885. And that the arrival of that bicycle gives us a great big bicycle boom, because suddenly this is a kind of democratizing device. It's a machine that old people can ride, that young people can ride, that
and women can ride.
Women were both thought to be able to ride. Right. Exactly, because prior to this time, bicycling was kind of a niche endeavor. It was really thought to be for sportsmen and daredevils, but it wasn't viewed as a viable form of mass transit, or it wasn't the bicycle wasn't seen as a commuter vehicle or really a pleasure vehicle for the masses. But the arrival of this safety bicycle brought millions of these things to market. You have millions of riders in the US and in Western Europe. And this huge bicycle boom is greeted both by a kind of sense of incredible wonder. In 1880, I say in the book, I cite this in the book, but in 1896, the Detroit Tribune, I think it was, described the bicycle as the greatest invention of the 19th century and said that history would remember it as such. When you think of the other inventions that were the daguerreotype, whatever, the movie camera, the steam locomotive, that came in the 19th century. That's quite a statement. But in any case, it was greeted both by the sense of wonder and by moral panic, and huge backlash, from many areas of society. We may get into some of the moral questions that surrounded the bike, but you're talking about the kind of the marketplace ramifications of it. So certainly, first and foremost, it was a threat to the primacy of the horse and of horse-drawn travel. So all the industries that were centered around horses and hackney carriages
Jody,
and things like that were yeah.
I got this advertisement I pulled out of your book, a Columbia bicycle advertisement. The ever saddle horse that eats nothing.
Yeah, exactly. So, the bicycle was definitely promoted by manufacturers of bikes, and they sort of in the general discourse as a successor to the horse, and therefore a threat to these horse industries. But also, it was thought that that people were no longer going to church because they were too busy riding bicycles. They were no longer filling the bars because it was said they were too busy, sort of jacking themselves up on caffeine and going out for long bike rides in the country. It was supposedly a threat to like every industry you can name under the sun, from the cigar industry, and people who rode bikes no longer wanted to smoke cigars because they were health nuts, was the thought. It was thought to be putting libraries out of business, booksellers, newspapers. It was said we're going to go defunct because no one had time to read anything anymore because all they wanted to do was ride bikes, etc. So there was a great deal of hysteria around the bike, both pro and con in this period, and yes. And a lot of it had to do with these economic ramifications.
So let me read another quote from your book, and then this was in the Nebraska State Journal, written in 1896. The president of the Women's Rescue League wrote, "Bicycle riding is leading women headlong to the devil," and she proposed that Congress take action to ban women from riding. Tell us about the quote that is attributed to Susan B. Anthony and how bicycling and the bicycle really did, in a sense, liberate women.
Right. So Susan B. Anthony said of the bicycle, it was now I'm paraphrasing, the greatest, the invention most responsible for the emancipation of women, or the thing that was most responsible for the emancipation of women, compared to any other invention, something along those lines. I'm mangling the quotation, but the point was that the bicycle was viewed as kind of central to the feminist movement of this period, both because it was kind of a form of a catalyst of personal emancipation for women. That is, it offered a previously unattainable form of personal mobility for many women, particularly kind of middle class and haute bourgeois women whose movements, in kind of Anglo-American Victorian society were very circumscribed prior to this time. It was thought that women couldn't go out and about in cities without proper well-bred women should be chaperoned if they were going out in public. Well, here was a bicycle which kind of supersized their, which supercharged their mobility and allowed them to move freely and speedily through the landscape across cities and run into God knows what kind of excitement and trouble, right? So on the one hand, for feminists, this was viewed as a wonderful development. Also, it was thought to be, and in fact was, a form of mass mobility for female activists, for feminist activists. So, for instance, advocates for women getting the vote, suffragists during this period took to bicycles en masse and rode them in large numbers to protest, kind of rode bicycles to the barricades. And there were a number of, kind of very utilitarian reforms and other areas of life which impacted women, which came directly from the bicycle. So, for instance, what was called the rational dress movement was really kicked off or catalyzed by the arrival of the bicycle, because if you think about what Victorian women in, say, the US were wearing during this period, there were you think of these big whalebone corsets and huge hooped skirts, which made, it was difficult to walk in those things, let alone mount a bike. So women who wanted to ride bicycles said, we need to get something, some better kind of clothing going here. So they famously embraced bloomers, which were these, big kind of pantaloons, these MC Hammer, genie pant kind of things. And both the bicycle and these new forms of dress became, symbols of so-called new womanhood. So there was a very strong connection between women's liberation, personal and political, and the bicycle, particularly in the 1890s and early part of the 20th century.
And the bicycle, you used the word protest a minute ago, and the bicycle has been frequently used in protest.
Yeah, around the world and across the centuries, the bicycle is a useful device for protesters of all sorts, because you can move quickly, you can elude surveillance, you can maybe elude capture if you're being borne down upon by, say, the police or government officials. So yes, the bicycle has been embraced in many places as a tool of protest. And in fact, it has been viewed by governments and regimes of various sorts who want to, control populations as a kind of enemy. So, for instance, in the Second World War, the German forces in the Netherlands and France famously confiscated bicycles from the population because they wanted to tamp down. They wanted to avoid the possibility of bicycle-borne protests or the way bicycles could be used in various types of guerrilla actions. I'm looking now at the pictures you've posted online here. We see the example at the top there of the way the Viet Cong used the bicycle in the Vietnamese War, what they would call the American War, as cargo vehicles for transporting munitions and materiel up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail connecting North and South Vietnam. And these bicycles were deeply, the use of these bicycles by the Viet Cong was super frustrating to American military officials who, their bombing campaigns, they would bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, take out bridges and things like that. They could hit tanks, they could hit other types of military vehicles, but bicycles proved difficult to subdue. So the bicycle has been put to various uses across the decades in politics on sort of both sides of the divide. I just want to make one more mention of this. On the lower left there, we see a picture of what looks to be like the Washington D.C. police. Bicycle mounted police officers. Of course, there are cycle cops in American police forces across the country these days, and we saw some very interesting examples of the way of the sort of a struggle for the politics of the bicycle during the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising, because many of the protesters in that post George Floyd uprising came out to these marches and demonstrations on bikes, and they were greeted, for instance, here in New York City by the bicycle police, including kind of very up-armored bicycle special forces here in New York. So you had the spectacle of police officers using bicycles as shields and as battering rams, kind of facing off with protesters mounted on bikes. So, I view this as really an instance of the fact that, like, the politics of the bicycle are really up for grabs. Lots of people like to say, oh, the bicycle, is a device of the left. Oh, but it's kind of it's a green machine, or a thought to be a kind of hippie mobile. But the bicycle can be put to use by anybody on any side of the political fence, and has been and continues to be, and there's kind of a perennial struggle for the politics surrounding the bicycle, and questions of mobility and control.
Whether George W. Bush rides his mountain bike or John Kerry rode his road bike.
Exactly. There you have it.
Let me bring in Mindy Mashburn from Dallas, and she asks, who was behind the idea that bikes would cause the moral decline and debauchery of women? Was it the church, men's organizations? Basically, whose interest was at risk as a result of women riding bikes?
I mean, I'd say all of the above and then some. If you think about the period when there was the kind of peak moral panic around women riding bikes, is in the U.S. in the 1890s. This was a period that represented a kind of there was a big kind of society-wide revolt against Victorian values taking place across the culture and popular culture, with for instance, things like ragtime music and changing mores and morals around sexual relations and sex roles, and certainly the arrival of the so-called new woman was perhaps the most threatening to upholders of the traditional moral order. So. Yes, there were, for instance, members of the clergy who kind of thundered against the bicycle from the pulpit. There were politicians who proposed enacting laws to ban the riding of bicycles by women, or ban women who rode bicycles from wearing these, what were considered, too modern or too racy forms of dress, i.e., pants, bloomers. And there was a vast literature in medical journals and other places that how to put this delicately, that took on the question or problem of women's sexuality and the bicycle. I mean, not to get too graphic about it, but there was a lot of discussion about bicycles themselves. Deflowering women, the way that the bicycle, what terrible things could befall a woman if she was riding a bicycle, and what the bicycle seat could do. And also there was the question of the bicycle seat stimulating women while they rode, of a big medical literature on bicycle riding as a form of masturbation, and how awful this was, and how terrible it was that young women were first becoming conscious of their sexuality while on a bike. So it was thought that it really we had that something must be done about this. And then there was the looming question of kind of, okay, here in the slide we're looking at, we see women on on these bicycles. Well, if they can get on a bicycle and ride anywhere unchaperoned, unsurveilled, what kind of men are they likely to meet? How are the traditional, let's say the traditional morality, the idea that women have to be celibate or practice as sexual abstinence prior to marriage, that was viewed to be threatened by the arrival of the bicycle and the mobility that it afforded to women, because they could bike off God knows where and meet God knows whom. So this was, as the questioner rightly says, it was something that there were a great many people all across society who were worried about this. And a great many people, I should say, who thought this was preposterous and ridiculous and kind of laughed it off.
Well, let's pull out the globe and do some traveling. Let's go first to Bhutan, a country that Eric Weiner, I don't know how many people have read his book, Geography of Bliss. He was so excited to go there, considered it was really on his bucket list, and you really fell in love with the country too. You enjoyed your time there. Why has cycling played such a role in that country?
Yeah, this is a really interesting example of the way a bicycle culture can take hold in an unlikely place. Because of course, Bhutan is in the Himalayas. It's a landlocked country that sits between two giants, between India to the south and China to the north. And it's the most mountainous country on earth. So it doesn't seem like the kind of place where you're likely to have a cycling culture, quote unquote. But there is one there. There's a big kind of vogue for cycling there, which was kicked off in an interesting way by the royal family there. It was really the fourth king of Bhutan, who as a teenager got sent to a fancy school in England, discovered cycling there, had a bicycle, kind of imported to Bhutan when he got back home, and it was really like the king's passion for cycling that made Bhutan that in the first place even brought bicycles to Bhutan, because it seems highly likely that Bhutan was the last place on earth, the last nation on earth that the bicycle reached. Bhutanese people are well aware of the fourth king and his successor, the fifth king, his son's passion for bicycles. And because of their interest in cycling, and particularly mountain cycling, kind of sport cycling in the mountains that surround the capital city, Thimphu, more and more people have taken to cycling, and there's a kind of thriving culture of mountain biking in Bhutan. There's a famous race there that takes place, which is billed as the most difficult one-day race in the world, the Tour of the Dragon, and a decent percentage of the population have been taking to bicycles, and the government itself has been encouraging the riding of bicycles and the kind of development of a so-called bicycling culture, both because it's great exercise, because the king's the royal family is very into it, but also because Bhutan is in many ways perhaps the greenest country on earth. You're very dedicated to sustainability there. So
did you ride there?
I rode a little bit. I rode in the capital city, Thimphu. I did not attempt to ride, to storm up and down the Himalayas. That is well beyond my ken as a cyclist. You know what I'm going to do? I noticed that it's looking murkier and murkier where I am. If you don't mind me, I'm going to turn on a light behind me. So you get a little live from Brooklyn light turning on.
All righty,
action.
we can do that. Well, while you're doing that, let me just remind everyone that we have a terrific Century ride in Santa Fe called the Santa Fe Century, and it'll be in May, and I hope that many of you will come and ride with us. Got a great riding culture here in Santa Fe. And let me thank too Mindy and Scott Mashburn. Mindy asked a question. They're on boards of several organizations in Dallas, and want to thank all of those organizations for being on tonight's program, and please share it with others. So let's go and talk about the economics of, in a sense, and livelihood of the bicycle. You went to Dhaka, Bangladesh, and met a rickshaw driver and got to know him. God, what a tough job that is. And it makes you think a bit too, just sort of the human rights dimension of a man pulling another man so.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of discussion and controversy around the use of rickshaws in Bangladesh and other places in Asia. But in the city of Dhaka, Bangladesh, here we see some images of Dhaka. These kind of cycle rickshaws, which are these three-wheeled vehicles, which have a kind of a seat in the back with a hood that you can see, very colorfully decorated machines. These really dominate the cityscape. They're like the yellow cab used to be here in New York. They're really the primary means of navigating an extraordinarily densely populated city. Dhaka is the world's most densely populated and fastest growing mega city. There are 22 million people there squeezed into a very small area. It's a city dominated by slums, although it's also a vibrant city with pockets of affluence and a really vibrant and vital place where, so it was a great pleasure and a great education to visit it that place. But as you mentioned the economics, one of the things that I was really interested in writing about was the role that the bicycle plays in transportation and economics around the world. Here in the U.S., we often think of the bicycle as like as a kind of a leisure device, a kind of vehicle for sport and pleasure riding, or a kind of lifestyle accoutrement. But in many places around the world, it's not lifestyle or leisure. It's livelihood and way of life. There's a vast workforce across the global South that use it for whom the bicycle is, that's how they do their work. So there are people who deliver things on bicycles. There are fruit stalls mounted on bicycles. There are bicycle ambulances in countries in Africa, bicycle, marketplaces that are both supplied by bicycles and that are sort of mounted on bicycles across Latin America, and in Asia, especially, the use of bicycles and pedal-driven vehicles as cargo vehicles is a huge phenomenon that I think is really poorly understood. A recent study suggested that in China alone, there are between 40 and 60 million cargo bicycles and tricycles. That is, vehicles that are schlep stuff around, goods and raw materials around the cities, mostly, of China. If you think about that number, 40 to 60 million cargo bicycles, that is a number which exceeds the total combined number of cargo ships, planes, trucks, and trains across the world. So in other words, we're talking about a workforce which is vast and poorly understood, that plays an important role in the global economy, and especially, I think, in the kind of last mile flow of goods. So yes, and in Dhaka, there are tons of these cargo rickshaws as well that really keep the city's economy humming. But I did go over there to look at these bicycle rickshaw wallas, as they're called, these rickshaw drivers, sort of the cabbies of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and to learn about what their work is like, what their lives are like, and indeed, their lives is very difficult. It's extremely arduous work, but it's also work with a lot of dignity. But it really was a very eye-opening experience for me, both in terms of the role that the bicycle plays in the developing world, but it also opened my eyes to the bicycle workforces that are analogous right here in my home city in New York. So for instance, during the pandemic, it was the people known as the deliveristas. That is largely Latin American undocumented immigrants who deliver food on these, sort of app-based food delivery services that kept the city going in the peak months of the pandemic, when New York was really the epicenter of the virus in the spring of 2020. It was this bicycle delivery force that kept the restaurant industry alive here and delivered food to millions of New Yorkers who were, in their apartments quarantining. So I had to go halfway across the world in order to, have my eyes open to the people who are, working for their bread under difficult conditions right here in my home city. And this was one of many things in reporting this book that made me think a lot differently about the bicycle and the role that it plays in our daily lives.
Well, also, you were a bicycle messenger for a few years.
That's true. I was a bicycle messenger back in the wild and woolly days of the late 1980s. This was in the city of Boston, where I was living at the time, and this was during the period, prior to the rise of certainly email and the internet, but also even right before the fax machine. when, you know, bicycle messengers, like if you needed something delivered across town in a speedy way through a gridlocked city, you gave it to a sweaty, disreputable looking person on a bicycle, and they would weave through the traffic and get it to your destination. Yeah, that was probably the most fun job. I mean, I like my current job. It's cool being a reporter, but it's not as fun as being a bike messenger. So yeah, in some sense, I like.
Don't you ride your bike to work?
That's a job. That's a job.
You ride your
Yeah, I
bike
ride
to
my
work
bike
now,
everywhere
don't you?
still. So like, no, I can't.
Do you own a car?
I ride my bike to work. No car. No car. Yeah, the bicycle's definitely the best way to get around New York. I mean, a car is a nightmare in New York. You know, you can buy, you know, right now, my dad is out of town. He loaned me his car for a couple weeks while he's out of town. And it's great because we can like my wife and kids and I can get out of the city for a trip or two. So that's real nice. But, you know, having to park a car in New York City and even drive one around, it's a pain in the butt. So no,
It's the same situation in Santa Fe. A lot easier just to get a good strong lock and put your bike on a lamppost. Let's go back and talk about China a bit more because Tiananmen Square, the bike played a key role on really both sides of the conflict. And I hope we can pull up the picture of that. But go ahead and describe what we're seeing. Good, we have the photo.
Yeah, so those are images of, well, on the left there, you see the sheer number of bicycles that were in the city of Beijing. Once upon a time, you know, China was known as the kingdom of the bicycle in the kind of latter decades of the 20th century. Cycling was not only encouraged but almost mandated by the Chinese Communist Party. The most famous, the kind of Ford or GM bicycle of China, is a bicycle called the Flying Pigeon, which is this really sturdy black cruiser bicycle. Those are the bicycles we were looking at there. And it was Deng Xiaoping, the supreme leader of China, said at one time that a goal of his was to put a flying pigeon in every household in China. And they very nearly pulled it off. At the peak of bicycle ownership in China, there were some 523 million, I think is the figure, bicycles in China, which is a staggering number if you think about hundreds of millions of bicycles on the road every day. And there really wasn't car ownership there, you know, by private citizens to speak of at all. Most people got around, whether in cities or in the countryside, by bicycle. There was also another image you flashed up there where we saw the student protesters heading into Tiananmen Square on bicycles. You also saw army tanks there. I think that must have been in the aftermath of the June 4th, 1989 crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protest, and that famous pro-democracy protest of the spring of 1989 was in many ways a bicycle protest. You know, the hundreds of thousands and eventually more than 1 million students who flooded into Tiananmen Square, many of them came on bicycles. Bicycles served important roles in sort of providing, you know, moving bodies and stuff, gear in and out of Tiananmen Square during the occupation. They were used to serve meals, as, you know, kind of makeshift hospital beds for protesters during the protest. And then famously during, you know, on that horrible night of the crackdown on June 3rd into June 4th, 1989, bicycles played a role in really trying to combat the arrival of the army troops. Beijing citizens threw bicycles at the tanks, trying to throw them under the treads of the tanks in an effort to stop the advance of the Chinese army. And of course, there are these harrowing images of kind of flattened and mangled bicycles that were littered all over Tiananmen Square in the aftermath of the crackdown. There were people who kind of bicycled into the teeth of the gunfire in order to try and get fellow protesters out of there. So yeah, the bicycle played a very important role in that,
And
you know.
China's really had a love-hate relationship with the bicycle. Scott says in the U.S. bicycling has always been. What about in China? He says, hasn't bicycling declined as car ownership has gone up dramatically? And cars were not private citizens were not allowed to buy cars until, like, what was it, in the 70s, or when were Chinese citizens?
Yeah, yeah. There was the very first private ownership of cars took place then, but it really didn't happen on a mass scale until the early part of this century, when China made it a sort of they not only decided to create an automotive industry, but they set the goal of creating the world's largest automotive industry and largest consumer market for motor vehicles, and sort of went hard into car culture across the board, and that was accompanied by what I call, this is my coinage, but sort of de-bikeification. That is, an effort on the part of the government, by the state, to discourage cycling, in many cases through outright bans, through and through sort of marginalizing bicycles in various ways, making roads that were previously dominated by bikes totally inhospitable to bikes, super dangerous to ride bikes, and so the questioner is quite right, or the commenter is quite right, that China has gone from this, a bicycle culture without precedent and analog to a car culture without precedent and analog. So now, the old urban cores in China were kind of destroyed, and they were kind of refigured for car culture, and so now you have 8-lane highways that kind of sweep through old city centers, and in China they have a network of highways which is vastly bigger than our own interstate highway system, which is just boggles the mind to even think of that, and it's only recently that China has begun, the Chinese government has begun to kind of once again rethink, after being a bicycle culture, then becoming a zealous car culture and discouraging cycling. Now they're kind of in the process of rethinking that, particularly with the advent of the e-bike, and so China is kind of returning to the bicycle in lots of interesting ways, even though it remains primarily a car culture.
So, Jody, where are we now in the United States? We have a question or a comment from one of our viewers. I used to be a cycle commuter in LA. There, he said, I really had no problem. Sharing the road was understood by both cyclists and drivers. Now he lives in Jacksonville, where people say, get off the road, use the sidewalk.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised and heartened to hear that was his experience in LA in the first place. I know some cyclists in LA who would say that they had a Jacksonville like everyday existence when it comes to their interactions with motorists. But the point is well taken in general. I think it's across the board, the United States is behind many other parts of the world in terms of our understanding of particularly the how cities work best, and how we how we ideally move through them. We're at a moment now, I think, where there's in part due to the pandemic and the huge cycling boom that was kicked off by the pandemic, but largely because of bigger, more existential questions about climate change, sustainability, where we're policymakers and politicians in this country are finally seem like there's sort of a stirring of interest, I would say, in rethinking our relationship to the automobile, particularly in cities, and embracing alternative forms of transportation, of so-called micromobility. So not just bicycles, but scooters, electric scooters, all kinds of clearing room on the roads for, I'd say, especially bicycles, but other forms of alternative transport that aren't motor vehicles. Because after all, a bicycle really is, I think I can say this not just as someone who loves cycling and not just as a kind of as a bicycle zealot, but as someone who's like tried to look dispassionately at this question and who has read the literature on it. And I think that the experts agree that we can have cleaner, healthier, happier, safer, more sustainable cities if we discourage the riding of cars and take steps to really actively discourage them, everything short of banning the use of cars in urban centers and clearing room on the roads for bicycles. This is definitely controversial, but in many places where, for instance, city planners have gotten rid of parking places in cities. We think, of course, of, famously the cities of Northern Europe.
Well, right here, we're looking at Amsterdam.
Right, exactly. So Amsterdam, Denmark, places in Norway, and other places all around the world that have embraced kind of cycling and made it much more difficult to drive a car into the center of town. They have seen great outcomes for public health, and I'd say public happiness, because what people realize, one thing, there's kind of a mental leap you need to make, and in order to get yourself on a bike, particularly if you're an adult who maybe hasn't ridden one around for a while or used one as a commuter vehicle. But if you are in an environment where it's safe to ride a bike, and you're riding on bicycle lanes that are separated from motor vehicle traffic, you realize how pleasurable and how much more efficient a way it is to move around town, and how much better it is than, for instance, like sitting in chock-a-block traffic on a horrible hot day, getting angrier and angrier. So
there's a happy family.
Yes, indeed. That's Amsterdam right there. But yeah, in answer to the question where we're at, we've got a long way to go, and it's going to take some brave politicians and policymakers who are ready to make hard decisions, maybe encounter some resistance at first. But if the results in other places around the world are any guide, people, once you create the proper infrastructure, people, it's possible for cycling culture to thrive, and people don't miss their cars all that much, at least in terms of moving through cities. And we've been seeing these images of Amsterdam. Well, up until 1970, Amsterdam was absolutely chock-a-block with cars, as filled with cars as Dallas, as anywhere you can name. And it was kind of a revolt by the citizens against traffic accidents, and there were a number of children who were killed because of motor vehicle accidents there. That it took protest and some brave politicians to transform those cities. And now the reason so people go over to Amsterdam and have so much fun there is because it's a city that moves, that travels in a different way.
Yeah, I crossed one of the bike paths as a pedestrian, and somebody yelled at me, and I said, "Wait a minute, I'm sorry, I'm a cyclist." I just wasn't used to that. Exactly. All right, we got just another minute or two. You did something in writing this book and researching it that I don't know if I have the guts to do, and that is you rode with the famous stunt rider, McCaskill.
Yes, this is about that. Yeah, this is a guy named Danny McCaskill. I encourage everybody, all of our viewers here, to Google Danny McCaskill, go on YouTube and look him up, and you'll get to see his incredible the videos he makes, which document his stunt riding, his doing things like riding up walls, riding up trees, jumps from improbable heights across great chasms. He's what's called a street trials rider, so he kind of does this kind of form of freestyle riding, which emphasizes balance and various other kinds of amazing stunts. And it's sort of like parkour. If you know the sport of parkour, he sort of navigates various landscapes on bicycle, climbing, jumping, but on a bicycle. So he's really an amazing athlete, and his videos are extremely entertaining to watch. And yes, I traveled to to meet him in Glasgow, Scotland, where he lives, and my idea was I was going to get to go see him sort of do this stunt ride in an urban environment and kind of sit off to the side and watch him. But he said, no, you got to come for a ride with me. Let's go mountain biking. So I thought, since I ride my bike every day in New York, this would be no sweat. I've ridden a mountain bike before, but he took me to a very sort of beginner's level mountain biking course, and it proved to be well beyond my abilities as a cyclist. And yes, I wound up flying over my handlebars and landing on my backside and suffered an embarrassing injury. But I lived to tell.
Well, we got 30 seconds left. Where's your favorite place to ride?
New York City. hate to be boring, but I ride here every day and I love it. I love biking in cities, you know, but the reason I love bicycles so much, I think it dovetails with my love of cities and urban living. But I'll just add Paris, also another great city that I've lived in. And Paris has really become, since the pandemic, their mayor there, Anne Hidalgo, is going hard into into bike culture, and they've really transformed that city. So that's become a much more bike friendly city. I just got back from a little trip there, and yes, so let me say New York and Paris.
Well, you know, I was with a writer of The Economist, and he was going to San Francisco, he was telling me he was going to go bicycling, and I said, well, let's bicycle here in Dallas. And he goes, Dallas? And we had a great time. So want to thank you for being with us. Come to Dallas. You'd be surprised how nice it is to ride around White Rock Lake. Come to Santa Fe. We got great mountains here. And to all of you who joined us today, I hope you really will pick up a copy of Jody's book. As I mentioned, I first heard about it in the review in The Economist and The New Yorker, and I thought, I got to meet this guy. And I know you'll really enjoy the book as well. Somebody asked if this program is recorded so that they could rewatch it. Yes, indeed it is. And please forward the link to your friends and all cyclists. Jody, continued success with your work, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim. It was really fun.
Great. And thank you to all of our sponsors. Have a great evening and ride safely.